Hello and welcome to this OMFIF briefing. This is Danai Kyriakopoulou. I'm Chief Economist and Director of Research at OMFIF here from London. And I'm joined by three panelists. So we have Bill White joining us from Canada with a long background in the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the Bank for International Settlements, and more recently at the OECD. We have David Marsh, our OMFIF chairman, also from London. And we also have Mark Sobel, the former Treasury official and US chairman for OMFIF. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you also to all of you listening. So some housekeeping things first. This is an on-the-record briefing. We will be posting it to our website later. And you're free throughout the briefing to send notes to us on the chat function. And we'll be asking the questions to the panelists in the second half of the webinar. So starting with you, Bill. So we've seen extraordinary policy responses to the coronavirus crisis so far. We've seen both the fiscal side, monetary policy responding to this. How would you judge the overall policy response to this? Perhaps comparing it also with the previous big shock that we had, the financial crisis of 2008 and the Lehman collapse. This was more of a financial shock that became a real economy shock. Now we're seeing the other way around, but we've still seen a lot of actions from central banks. How would you judge it in terms of the timeliness, the scale, and also the level of coordination? Because this is a very big international shock that has hit a lot of countries simultaneously. So what's your overall assessment to start off?
Well, I think it's desperate times call for desperate measures, and I think the governments and the central banks in particular are to be generally applauded for what they've done. I mean, they've stepped right into the breach, big supply side shock, as you said, to begin with, demand side repercussions. The governments and the central banks have both pulled out all the stops, and I think what they've done up until now has been the right thing. Not 100%. I mean, there's some cases, the US, where I think it's been less targeted than I think it ought to have been. But broadly speaking, I think people should be given pretty good marks for what they've done up until now. The one area that you did mention, of course, international coordination. The honest truth is there's been very little on that front. And in fact, the governments themselves have contributed, as it were, to this process of deglobalization that seems to be going on. We're moving back into a kind of autarky. I read the G20 press release, or at least the communique after the meeting, and the virtual meeting that they had just a couple of days ago. And basically, there's very little there that talks about sort of overt cooperation and what they intend to do, targets, and that kind of thing. But in terms of the individual governments, I think one could say the response has been good up until now. Where we go forward here in terms of the rebound, I think the absolutely central question, over which I have no answer because it's in the area of health and epidemiology as opposed to economics, is where do the governments draw the line in the trade-off between the lockdown, which saves lives, at least short term. Where's the trade-off between the lockdown, which saves lives, and the lockdown, which costs enormous amounts to the economy, both in terms of demand and potentially even supply going forward? And for this, I have no answer. And I've been looking and trying to see whether there's any kind of convergence of views about the health and the political response, in a certain sense, about where do we say enough is enough on the lockdown side, where are the benefits and the costs. I'm not seeing any clear way out of this thing. There will be an out. I mean, clearly we can't have this lockdown forever, but the question of when it will come, what the criteria will be, that's going to be one of the crucial questions in terms of determining the size and pace of the recovery.
Thank you, Bill. Let's turn to you, Mark. What are your views on these issues? Do you think there is a trade-off between the lockdown and the economic cost? Should we be seeing it in this way? We've also seen countries who've not gone as far on the lockdown that have also been very negatively affected. This is becoming now an economic shock that is very hard to avoid. But of course, shutting down economic activity and the more you keep those measures in place is directly affecting GDP rates and the forward-looking macro indicators. But at the same time, it's very unpredictable looking at the health trajectory of the virus. So what is your view on that? And would you agree with Bill? Would you give good marks to the policy responses that we've seen so far? Has it been fast enough, big enough? And also, how would you judge it across different countries and different regions?
Well, thank you for that question. With regard to health, I think we have to flatten the curve and get to the other side of it before we're going to be confident in people returning back to work and seeing a resumption of economic activity. So the sooner that happens, the better. And the longer it takes, the more damage there's going to be to our economies. So I have a difficult time thinking of trade-offs per se. Perhaps in the U.S., if we had much better testing for the virus in place, we could test, and if people were okay, we could reintroduce them. But I don't think we are, as a society, are there yet. So I think we need to get this health situation in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible. And if we don't, it'll just be even more degrading for the economy. In terms of the response, I think it's been pretty radical in the United States. Now, obviously, the response to the 2008-9 crisis was radical. This has been even more radical. It's been very quick. On the fiscal side, in the global financial crisis, the Recovery Act was worth maybe 5% of GDP. We had TARP on top of that. In a much faster period of time, we've seen 3 fiscal bills out of the executive and legislative branches worth over 10% of GDP. Another is being hotly debated, and that could add another 5% of GDP in support. If you look at the trajectory of the Fed balance sheet, so basically it was around $900 billion before Lehman, and it was over $2 trillion by January, but it then stayed there. Already the Fed balance sheet has grown from around 4 to over 6 trillion. So you've had much bigger and faster fiscal and monetary responses. Now, so very fast, very different kind of fiscal stimulus than we had. And so I think that in the U.S. We have to give fairly good marks. We can debate the components of the fiscal. I think the Fed has done an excellent, aggressive job. Would you like me to comment on multilateral coordination, or we'll come back there?
Yes, we'll come back to that, but let's focus a little bit more on the Fed since you brought it up. And yes, you said they've done an excellent response. How would you say the Fed is balancing its role as the global provider of liquidity and safe haven assets in terms of the dollar being the safe haven asset of the world? How do you think that system is challenged right now where we're having a flight to safe haven assets compared to the role of the Fed in supporting the U.S. economy?
Well, as you know, the Fed is the central bank of the United States of America, and we don't have a true global lender of last resort, given that we live in a world of nation states. So the Fed is guided essentially by its dual mandate. But as you just said, the dollar is de facto the world's overwhelmingly predominant currency, and the dollar's performance overseas can clearly impact the health of the global and U.S. financial systems. So the Fed is well aware of the dollar's global role, financing role, reserve currency role, and when pressed into action, it becomes a reluctant global lender of last resort. And it's not a task that the Fed willingly takes on, but it does what it has to do. So the Fed responded with the standing swaps in place to begin with, but it expanded the swap lines. It's started to offer repos facility for foreign central banks. And those actions resulted in a substantial calming down of the prior spike in the cross-currency basis points. So the international side has calmed down. The FX markets aren't as functioning ideally, but they're getting the business done, allowing the Fed to focus on more of these other markets that have been blowing up, be it asset-backed securities or commercial paper or money markets and things of that nature. So I think the Fed has been mindful of its international, of the dollar's international role, and I give them good marks for taking that under its wing, and I would say taking it under its wing a bit more aggressively than it did in the global financial crisis, where I thought it was quite responsive on this front as well.
Thank you, Mark. So interesting, both you and Bill as former policymakers are giving good marks to the current policymakers. I'll turn to David for his views as well, and then maybe after, it'd be good to get the audience's view on that as well, so we can run a poll on whether you think that the G20 response overall has been good enough or not fast and big enough, or whether it depends on the jurisdiction. So we'll launch that after we've gone to David. But David, what is your view? And also we've heard a lot about the US, focusing a bit more on the euro area, where Mark spoke about the very fast fiscal response that we've seen in the US, how quickly the bills passed. Of course, in the euro area, it's much more heterogeneous, it's much more complicated because of the system of different fiscal authorities. How do you judge the response that we've seen here in the UK and the Bank of England and Treasury versus the euro area and more globally? Would you give them good marks? And also, what more is there to see? Because we've had the Eurogroup meetings this week, and there's quite a few proposals on the table in terms of how the euro area can move forward.
No, I wouldn't give them good marks at all. And unfortunately, all the structural defects that we know about in the euro area have been laid bare. Clearly, that's not to say that all the response has been terrible, but it's been very national, as everybody has said, in the euro area. And that's okay in a relatively normal situation. Of course, the Germans are now saying, well, we've hoarded up all this grain in our granary over the years of relatively parsimonious fiscal policies. We can now use that. Not every country has got that reservoir. And so the inability of the EU at an EU level to act in a very powerful way has been in some contrast to the ability of individual countries to act. And of course, each to their own. Some countries do it better than others. The Germans, despite some faults that they've had in the system, have clearly got out of the tracks quite quickly with a massive stimulus package and also a very large amount of guarantees. I think the fiscal package alone is 5% of GDP. If you throw in the guarantees, something like 13%, if they were all to be used. That is a massive fiscal stimulus. After 6 years of budget surpluses, you can say they can afford to do that. They also have better medical facilities in lots of ways. Also, the federal system has been quite helpful, I think, in Germany, and the multiple testing that we all know about, which is one of the reasons why the death rate has been relatively low, simply because the denominator of the number of people being tested is that much higher. So the ECB has been back in action and is basically the backstop. All governments are actually quite happy about that, even though some of them are crying crocodile tears about possible monetary financing. But everybody is actually quite pleased that the ECB is doing all the heavy lifting as it did before. Just two additional points. Rather like in 2008, 2009, there'll be a lot of recriminations in the future about why didn't we see this coming. And people like Bill, who were pointing out to the imbalances building up before 2008, 2009, the people on the virology side, medical side, will again be pointing out they did see this coming, and they did say that there could have been some warning. So we're going to see that again. Whether or not that'll be propitious remains to be seen, but there will be a big debate about who was to blame, so to speak, for not seeing the early warnings early enough. A bit like Queen Elizabeth said in the London School of Economics a few years ago, why didn't anybody see the global financial crisis coming? And then the second point is really this, what you've referred to as a trade-off. This is really one of the most heinous parts of the whole conundrum. And it's like a siege, if you think about it, to use an appropriately medieval term, because this is a siege where it seems as though the initial response, i.e. locking yourself up in a castle, you are actually withstanding the crisis because the invaders are not getting in. The more it goes on, the more you become weakened. You use up your water, you use up your bread, you use up your armaments. And the people outside know that sooner or later they're going to get through. And I don't want to be too bloody about this, but this is similar. Talk about the multipliers. The French and Germans have worked out that for every week that this goes on, you lose 0.5% of GDP. At least it gets bigger over time. If it went on for 3 months, it'll be more like 1% every week. So there's only a limited number of days that you can go on with this. You're hoping against hope that people will come out and go back into the new world like after a nuclear winter, and they won't get infected. What happens if the disease does reproduce? The virus replicates itself in some new and still more hateful form, and people don't know about that. So I'm afraid to say people are using up their reserves rather quickly. Those with large sovereign funds are doing it better than others, the Norwegians, Singaporeans and so on. The US, the sovereign currency of last resort, can use its sovereignty quite well here. The British are going down probably towards the monetary financing route. They can do that. They're a sovereign nation. That's pretty debilitating if you're in the euro area. You don't have your own currency.
Dana, could I just add one point too? I mean, to the siege thing. I suggested that the response of the governments and the central banks up until now had been appropriate. You know, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. They dealt with that problem. But the fact of the matter is that using fiscal and monetary policy on the scale that we have over any extended period will also have side effects that are not sustainable over time. And we will be back into inflation territory at some point. The really interesting question, it's a variation on David's theme, is how long can you keep on doing this without basically causing problems that are even bigger than the problems you're trying to solve? These are legitimate.
Very good point. And we will move to talk about the longer term impacts and the side effects, because that's something that we've been debating a lot about the previous response to the previous crisis. But let's pause for a minute to conduct a poll with the audience, because we have a lot of market participants. It'd be good to get their views as well. So how do you rate the G20 response to the global COVID-19 health crisis? Of course, it may depend on the jurisdiction. We've heard different views about the euro area, the Bank of England, the Fed and elsewhere. But on average, would you agree with what the panelists have been saying? Some have said poor, some have said good. Where do you stand? So please vote, and we'll launch the results shortly before we move back to our panel.
Denai, can I make a comment on that while people are voting?
Yes, of course. Go ahead, Mark.
I think David began to put his finger on it. So I think the Fed's response has been very good. I think the U.S. fiscal response has been quite dramatic. I think that the ECB's pandemic emergency purchase program is quite radical. I think that what you're seeing are a bunch of national actions being taken in response to a crisis. And of course, they're being taken in the terrain of fiscal and monetary and external, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is the case that the U.S. fiscal and monetary authorities can respond forcefully and responsibly, and yet they're doing that as part of a patchwork of national responses in response to this common global crisis. So you can have very poor multilateral cooperation and yet still have decent national responses. So I've written this. I wrote this in an OMFIF piece a few weeks ago, that the multilateral framing for the responses is not there. G20 cooperation has been poor. It's lacked the dynamism of the global financial crisis. I think you see the lack of cooperation, for example, particularly in the trade realm. People are acting individually in terms of monetary and fiscal policy, more I would say fiscal. I do think the central banks are coordinating well behind the scenes. But it seems that these are national responses. They're lacking a multilateral framing. So I think while I can give the U.S. good marks, I cannot give the global community good marks on multilateral cooperation. And much of this has to do with this administration, which has a more nationalistic bent and thinks about America and doesn't think internationally.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, and this is a very international issue, but it does show how we may expect other similar issues of international nature to be dealt with in the future, and we'll move to that. But let's see the responses to our poll before we move on. So let's look at the results. So 39% said good, 36% average, and 24% poor. So that's not so bad marks for our global policymakers and the G20 response, but also not raving reviews, so still more to do. Let's go back to our panel. So Bill, let's talk, and also to remember to send us the questions through the chat function. So we've started seeing some questions coming in already, and one is about this international cooperation, but also not just across nations, but also across disciplines. So one of our listeners is asking about, there seems to be a global collaborative process emerging, combining public, private, and academic actors to address the scientific dimension of COVID-19. Could we see that as a silver lining, that this is something that may emerge to deal with other future global problems in the areas of health or even the climate crisis? What do you think? Is there some lessons that we're learning in terms of how the international communities can work together that we can use for future problems? Bill, what do you think?
Well, certainly on the scientific side, everything that I read, and I'm just reading off the net and the papers as everyone else, it sounds as if there's been a massive opening up of information and data spread between the scientific community to deal with both the question of vaccines and tests, both to test for the disease itself and to test whether somebody has had the disease. So that is all very positive, and people seem to have put the profit motive sort of totally behind them, and they're acting together for the greater common good. But that seems to be, can I say, the scientific community is doing that. But the popular community, I mean, as Mark said a moment ago, talking about the United States, has been heading resolutely in a kind of nationalist direction, populist direction for quite some period of time, and that's going to be a big ship to turn around. As it were, we need international cooperation more than ever on all of these different levels, and yet the popular will, such as it is, seems to be moving in the opposite direction. So we have a major political issue here, I think, going forward.
Thank you, David. Let's turn to you and let's take it back to Europe. So you touched a little bit on the Bank of England's latest announcements and how this may be interpreted by some as monetary financing. What is your view on the next steps that central banks could take in terms of, we've seen a lot of programs already. Mark also mentioned the pandemic emergency purchase program by the ECB. We've seen a lot of action from the Fed. There is a lot of talk about other steps that central banks can take, such as direct deficit financing or buying directly government bonds on the primary markets. How do you see that debate going?
Every one of these shibboleths is really being cast out of the window almost every day, and the longer this goes on, and I fear it will go on a bit longer than many people would hope or even expect, the more of these taboos will be broken. So Britain still does have a taboo, it seems, on monetary financing in terms of buying the government bonds directly from the Debt Management Office. The Bank of England doesn't do that at the moment. It lets the Debt Management Office sell them to brokers, basically, who then, or to dealers, perhaps one should say, through an electronic market, and then they sell that on, making a profit for themselves to the Bank of England. That's not a very efficient way of doing it. And this morning, in a relatively small way, more of a cash management measure, the Bank of England, the Treasury announced that they will be doing some direct purchases of government bonds, i.e. as soon as they are emitted. And although for reasons of monetary probity, Andrew Bailey, the new head of the new governor of the Bank of England, the new head of the Bank of England, has said that he's not going to do monetary finance. I believe that they will do. I also think this is sensible in a situation like this. It doesn't mean it's going to be done like that forever. In the euro area, of course, there is a legal ban on monetary financing, i.e. buying the debt directly from the government as soon as it issues it. You have to let it be on the secondary market at least for a few hours. It's all a bit unclear exactly how long it has to be on the secondary market. There's legal cases going on, and a lot of money and political stakes are here now on the table because the Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice have put down various markers about how these debt finance programs should be run. At the moment, the ECB, the pandemic program that Mark was alluding to, that is supposed to be there to maintain the monetary transmission of the euro area, to make sure all the countries are equal in terms of the ECB's monetary policy. It's running equally in all countries. And it's also there, of course, to try to maintain inflation at a 2% level. And it's below that level at the moment. But everybody knows the real job of the ECB is to prevent the spreads rising too much for the indebted countries. And that's why they came in on March the 18th. Mrs. Lagarde, in a very straightforward comment, has said very brusquely at the press conference on the 12th of March, the ECB is not here to lower the spreads. She could have been more nuanced. I think she wanted to get the question out of the way and move on to something else. Unfortunately, that did create a big upheaval in the bond markets and even more on the political markets. And she was told off in no uncertain fashion, also on the television that evening by Mr. Macron. And that resulted in this about turn. Actually, the ECB is there to lower the spreads when this outright monetary transaction program is inaugurated, if it ever will be the one that they announced in 2012. It's quite clear that the PEPP is there to keep the spreads down. And the fact that they're going to use the capital key in a very flexible way shows that over time, I'm sure they will use this program far more to purchase the Italian government bonds rather than the German bonds. But I think there's a necessary subterfuge because you do have the legalities of the situation. With ECB, you can imagine why it's doing it. It's going to use every single bit of fudge and leeway and flexibility that it can to maintain this painful pretense that it's not doing monetary financing.
Yes, and we've already seen in the first reports of the March purchases of the public sector purchase program considerable deviations from the capital key. The calculations are on the OMFIF website for whoever is interested in terms of the ECB has been over purchasing Italian, Spanish and French bonds and at the expense of Dutch and German bonds in particular. This continues the trend of the PSPP in general. So as you say, there is flexibility there with the capital key that can be used to target support to the countries that are needed. We're also seeing the results of the Target 2 balances coming in and showing the rising imbalances there. But let's turn to you, Bill, also on your views on what David has been talking about the ECB in particular and the sensitivities in terms of the PEPP. Yes, communication as well was an issue. We heard this comment from Madame Lagarde in terms of that we're not here to close the spread. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, also dismissing Corona bonds as a slogan, but then going back on that. So we've seen a few instances where policymakers have said something where perhaps they didn't expect it to have quite that effect that it did, and then going back on these statements. But also, Bill, I'd like to get your view on the monetary financing discussion that we've been having with David. I mean, what are your views in terms of the distinctions between quantitative easing and monetizing government debt at the point of issuance? How relevant is it whether the debt is bought directly from government or on the secondary markets? David mentioned this issue about the intermediaries that may be considered a waste of money. But if we think that we support quantitative easing as an effective policy tool, why would we oppose the direct government financing of deficits through money creation? So what are your wider views on helicopter money?
I think that what they've chosen to do is probably a result of a political compromise. That everybody knows that quantitative easing and things of that nature are effectively central bank financing of the government deficit, but they don't want it to appear to be too obvious. So a compromise was reached, do the secondary market, whatever. The bottom line is that quantitative easing, when the central bank massively increases the size of its balance sheet at the same time as the government is running big deficits, for all practical purposes, what the central bank is doing is financing that deficit. And that's just the reality of it. And so it seems to me that the Bank of England this morning, in a way, and I've just got it off the FT looking at the paper, what they've done is just recognize reality, which is that the simplest way to do it is for the central bank to simply provide the financing through running up its balance sheet explicitly. And they're talking about it being temporary at the moment, and I'm sure that is their intention, is this will be solely temporary. But the worry that one has, and it goes back to maybe we'll get back to this in a moment, it goes back to my concern about the longer run implications of these things, is that we know that so many government programs, when they're brought in a temporary basis, do wind up being permanent or semi-permanent. We never got back in any of our major countries to a level of the central bank's balance sheet that was similar to what we had prior to 2008. It just sort of ratchets its way up. So I think we do have to be concerned about that. The point that sort of worries me a bit, I guess, is that as soon as you get into sort of using directly sort of purchases by the central bank of effectively financing through an increase in reserves at the central bank, that financing is the shortest term possible financing that you can imagine of the government. So in a sense, QE is buying in the long-term stuff and replacing it with the shortest term government liability you can imagine, which is overnight money at the central bank. And some people, I think, are quite rightly worried about the longer run implications of that kind of behavior. And so I think what's being done, again, in the spirit of sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, man's got to do what a man's got to do to get through the crisis. We do need significant more thought going forward here about how we reverse all of this in the longer run. I'm certainly not saying overnight, but reverse all of this overnight to ensure, over time, to ensure that we don't have medium or longer term implications like significantly higher inflation that we all would not want to accept.
Thanks, Bill. Mark, what do you think on these longer term repercussions that we may see? You mentioned that you've not seen enough coordination as you would like. What would you like to see? And also, how do you think about this exit strategy and the potential additional innovations that we may see?
Well, I agree with much of what.
I think the big thing that's missing, Mark was quite right when he talked about the swap facilities. I was very worried that the Fed would have political constraints. There's a lot of stuff in Dodd-Frank that limits what they can do even at home. And I was afraid that they were not going to do what they have done with respect to the swap. So full marks to them. But in a sense, it's not enough at the international level. I mean, we've seen this massive outflow of capital from the emerging markets. I read just yesterday, there's already 80 countries that have approached the IMF for support. Do remember those swap lines are mostly with the big guys, and the countries in the emerging markets that have got so many problems are the smaller ones, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think there ought to be a lot of attention paid by the global community, the G20 in particular, to expanding the funds capacity to sort of deal with some of these poor countries, particularly through an expansion of SDRs. So that's one really big thing that needs to be done. The trade thing, Mark also mentioned too. I think it would give people some hope if the major countries, and in particular the United States and China, were to draw a truce to the tariff battles that were going on beforehand. So, on the international side, there's still an awful lot to be done. In terms of coming out of this stuff, as I said, I think the most important issue at the moment is really the question of the lockdown and how long it continues. And there on the health side, my own personal view is that you're only flattening, the only reason you're flattening the curve, okay? If you believe that in the end, you know, the integral of the curve is the same as it was before, you're just pushing out the herd immunity into the future. The only real gain that you're getting from all of this is you're allowing the hospitals to build up the resources to cope. And we should be putting an awful lot more money into that. Okay, recognizing that's the thing that is leading to the lockdown. We don't want to overburden the health service. Well, then we should be putting still more resources into that. And also, as Bill Gates has been saying, into vaccine and all that stuff, basically to use the scientific community's current willingness to act together to try to find a way out. So that, I think, is very important. Going down the line, we will be left here once the recovery begins, as it will inevitably, with huge increases in both government debts, whether they're in the form of explicit bonds or whether they're in the form of reserves at the central bank. And we should be trying to formulate ways to deal with those problems going forward to ensure that they don't, in the end, wind up with a significant inflationary impetus. I suspect that we will go back to something akin to financial repression, but whether, you know, that was practiced after the Second World War. But whether you can do that in the current world without sort of widespread capital controls and the rest of it, I simply don't know. But we will have a medium-term problem associated with using the methods that we have used to deal with the current problems. We shouldn't forget that.
Thank you, Bill. Let's turn to you, Mark, now. So Bill mentioned the role of the IMF. You've had a long career there as well. What is your view on how the fund can be mobilized to support emerging markets, which will be coming under a lot of stress under this? We've seen how under-equipped they are to deal with the health crisis. We've been seeing the numbers in terms of very few ventilators for countries with very, very big populations in Africa and elsewhere, also the trade disruptions that are affecting them and the capital outflows. So very big negative shocks for them. What do you think the role of the fund is there? And also reflecting a little bit on the wider issues that we've been discussing just now in terms of the exit strategy and the coordination aspects.
Well, thank you for that. So let me take those in reverse order. So on the exit strategy issues that Bill was just commenting on, I want to advertise a podcast I did the other day with Paul Tucker that you can find on the OMFIF webpage. So I believe that what we're seeing is a huge blurring of fiscal and monetary policy. Bill outlined it. So the Fed balance sheet is up $2 trillion. We just had a fiscal program in the U.S. of $2 trillion. So I'm one who believes that we need in the U.S. an independent and flexible tool for stabilization policy. And Bill referenced that when you have large debt and deficits, inevitably there's pressures from fiscal dominance or financial repression. And it used to be in the U.S. kind of during the World War II and afterwards that the Fed would buy up the Treasury paper at a given interest rate. the Fed was deeply concerned about inflation, and they reached an accord, and it was a nasty getting there, but they got to an accord in 1951 where the Fed wouldn't buy the Treasury paper willy-nilly. So I think going forward, one thing that we need to think about for the long term is how to better define the role of fiscal and monetary policy and their authorities' responsibilities. We talk about central bank independence. It's a bit of a misnomer in the sense that the Fed board members are nominated by the executive, they're approved by Congress. Congress has provided a dual mandate to the Fed. The Fed chair testifies often. But the Fed does have instrument independence, shall we say. And I want those decisions to be decisions about the Fed balance sheet to be made independently by the Fed. And I think that's an important issue for the future. One of Bill's successors at the Bank of Canada and now at BlackRock, Jean Boivin, did a podcast with me a few months ago on a piece that he had co-authored with Stan Fisher and others. And they wrote about how to preserve central bank independence in a world of blurring. Turning to the IMF, again, I'll self-promote myself. I did an OMFIF piece yesterday. It's on the web. It's about the IMF. Clearly, some 90 countries have already come to the fund for resources. The fund needs to be well stocked. And the other thing about this crisis is quite interesting is that because it's a liquidity or an exogenous shock, the normal response would be, well, to provide liquidity. But what does that mean for the future solvency of countries is another question. In any case, I've argued that the fund should increase its rapid financing. The fund's has just doubled its access for that. I believe the fund should augment programs and should implement its swap proposal from several years ago. On the low-income country side, clearly a need for rapid financing, a need to augment programs, a need probably for more debt relief, particularly from official bilateral creditors. And in the current global context, that means China, by and large. But what we don't want to see is IMF giving the IMF money to give to low-income countries and then having that pay off unsustainable Chinese debt. So I think those are some of the issues that we're going to need. I totally agree with Bill that this is an area where the IMF should step up along with the World Bank. And I'm somewhat hopeful that we're going to do that relatively well.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for giving homework to our listeners. There's a lot of good material on the OMFIF website, from commentaries to podcasts, so please do engage with those as well. I think you've made a very good point in terms of the trade-off of how do we balance the need for very big action now to get out of this crisis with the potential side effects that we may see in the future, and also the sustainability of debt positions. It'd be good to get the audience's view on that as well. So we will be running a poll on, do you think that we are doing too much stimulus given the negative long-term effects in terms of debt sustainability, or not enough in terms of getting out of this crisis now, because it's a difficult balance to strike. But while that is being prepared, let's move to the economic impact, because we've heard a lot about the policies, but what do we think about the transmission of the stimulus to the economy? How do we think the economic outlook is looking? And so, David, what do you think about this issue of debt sustainability given the policies that we've seen now? So one of our listeners is asking, looking at past the crisis and an eventual resumption of new normal activity, how will the world, governments, central banks and regulators deal with growing masses of debt in household, corporations and government? And debt to GDP is a ratio, so we have to think about the GDP as well, getting out of the crisis, but also the absolute level of the debt that has been increasing as a result of these policies. So what do you think of that balance before we get the audience's view on that as well?
Well, Bill is the great expert in looking at debt, and of course it has been rising, I believe, 50% worldwide anyway since the financial crisis a decade ago. So we're starting off from a pretty poor position from that point of view. The differential is quite startling. There are some countries, going back to the Aesop fable, the grasshopper and the ant, the thrifty ants built up this reservoir. So the Germans, they've got their debt to GDP down, the public debt to GDP down to 60%. They'll go up to 80% now. That is maybe manageable. In the euro area, the biggest and most troublesome debtor is Italy, and that'll go up from 130% to 150%. A lot less easy to manage. It won't be easy for anybody, but I think we'll see the differentials expressed in bond spreads. And then if you look at the emerging market economies, which we've not mentioned up to now, but of course they're going to be hatefully affected by all this. They will find it very difficult to borrow. We mentioned the IMF. The IMF is clearly going to have to step in there, or the World Bank, all kinds of multilateral financing programs. There's going to have to be debt forgiveness, I think, not just for the emerging market economies, but also possibly for countries in Europe. That's a pretty terrible consequence. We already saw Greece 10 years ago. If other countries were to get into that problem, I'm not saying they will, but if they do, then that's going to be a much bigger issue. So all the time, the onus will be on the central banks to keep the interest rates down. And I think that the problems will be when certain countries inside the euro area want to actually tighten money. And this will happen at some stage as the recovery picks up, and it might happen more quickly, more effectively in the northern countries. And the south will still be becalmed. So we'll have a repeat of what happened 10 years ago. All these measures, of course, are supposed to be temporary. I was reminded when Bill and Mark were talking about that of the 1931 departure from the gold standard. If you look at the press release that the Bank of England brought out in September 1931, it said this is, of course, a temporary measure that will be departing from the gold standard. So as the central bank governor said to me quite dryly the other day, there's nothing quite so permanent as a temporary ECB easing measure. But the big issue will be trying to raise interest rates when the going gets a little better and when inflation starts to rise. Some countries will want it, some won't. In the euro area, it's going to cause colossal problems. And just the last point here, I saw that the French are apparently suggesting having a bond issue just for the lucky nine, who are the ones who want to have corona bonds or whatever you call it. I think if they did that, that would be the schism of the euro area. It would be like the Pope of Constantinople and the Pope of Avignon. It would be like setting up two individual groups within the euro area. It would be the death knell for the unity of the euro, and it would really be a last resort if the nine who say they want these mutualized bonds, if they did that and left the creditor countries to make their own way. It'd be the debtors versus the creditors, and no prizes for guessing in which group the spreads would be quite large.
Thank you, David. Yes, the coalition of the willing proposal from the French to resemble how the euro area started, with a few countries that others then joined. But as you say, the question of the spreads is something that will be very important in this debate. Let's launch the poll now in terms of what the audience thinks of this question of stimulus. Is it going far enough? Is it going too far? And maybe while our listeners vote, Bill, you could add your views to that. As David described you as a great expert in debt, what do you think about this question from our listener that I read out earlier in terms of the growing masses of debt in household, corporations and government?
Well, I think that debt has been the problem, both public and particularly private, for quite a long period of time. And there should have been much more effort put into the issue of how do you deal with the debt problem. And one answer, of course, is the traditional answer is, well, you'll grow your way out of it. But of course, if debt is acting as headwinds in terms of spending, that has got a very limited chance of happening. In which case, the only other two alternatives are either a significant increase in inflation, faced with repression of the interest rates like we had in the post-World War II period with the Accord and all that sort of stuff. The other alternative is explicit debt write-downs, which is you accept the fact that the debt will not be paid off, that the creditors voluntarily accept 50 cents on the dollar as opposed to nothing, because 100 cents on the dollar is not on the table. So we need more discussion about our administrative and judicial procedures for dealing with debt that cannot be serviced, dealing with it in an orderly way. Because if it is not dealt with in an orderly way, it will be dealt with in a disorderly way. And I think that's what David is referring to when he starts talking about the European differentials. Stuff will start to happen because if something is not sustainable, it will stop. Our job is to start thinking about how we can turn that into an orderly process through the courts and through administrative processes and through people getting around the table, creditors and debtors, and deciding what it is that is doable. And looking at Europe, of course, at the moment, it doesn't give one a warm, fuzzy feeling about what's going to be possible when we start thinking about the creditors and the debtors sitting around the table.
Thank you, Bill. Let's see the results of our poll. What does the audience think? So pretty split response, but small majority thinks that we're actually doing too little, so not too concerned about how we're going to get out of this and the issues of debt sustainability. Mark, let's turn to you. What's your reaction to that response from our audience? And also to read out another question, taking us in a slightly different direction in terms of the shape of international trade going forward. This is a big shock to globalization in terms of travel, disruption to supply chains, also the realization that a lot of countries have not been able to rely on their own productions. They are very dependent on China. How do you think this will structurally impact the global economy?
Well, in terms of the audience thinking that maybe we're falling short now, obviously we've seen a massive collapse in private sector activity, and the public sector is in essence bridging that through macroeconomic policy. The response has been forceful, as we've agreed. Who knows what's exactly right now? But I do think that one has to balance the short-termism and the medium term a bit. Clearly, we're going to do more in the United States. The Fed just announced its Main Street lending program and its municipal liquidity facility. And as I mentioned, there's another fiscal bill beginning to wind its way through Congress that could be another 5% of GDP. So who knows whether this is an adequate response or not. But I do think Bill also points to some important longer-term issues. He mentioned whether the debt is sustainable within the context of countries. We really don't have time today to get into what I expect to be a wave of insolvencies in emerging markets and low-income countries resulting from the crisis, and how are we going to deal with that? What does that mean for sovereign debt? In terms of your question on trade, I do expect that this will be further disruptive to global value chains on top of the disruption that has been occurring in the last few years, and particularly in view of Mr. Trump's policies. I think that there's going to be less desire to have just-in-time inventories. I think that our economic policy orientations and thrusts are going to be more nationalistic. And we have seen an increasing protectionist sentiment in response to the crisis in terms of exports of medical goods and all that. So I don't see this as particularly positive for globalization or for trade going forward. trade will obviously be an important feature of our economies, but I think people will be more nationalistically minded.
I think
Thank you, Mark. Yes, Bill, maybe one last quick point because we're coming to the end of the briefing. But yes, Bill, you can have the final word.
On the real side, thinking about going forward, I think Mark's right. Deglobalization is coming. There's going to be much more concern about supply chain, resilience, all that kind of stuff. Something else that hasn't been mentioned is that there will be a significant degree of consolidation. The small and medium-sized enterprises are going to find it much harder than the big guys to see their way through the liquidity crisis. And when we get that consolidation, going back to the founding fathers in the United States, when you start getting the consolidation, you have to start worrying about the exercise of political power and the consolidated industries having that power and using it. So we should be thinking much more, again, about the medium-term consequences of all the stuff that we're doing and how we can stop the worst side effects from actually emerging. But maybe that's for tomorrow, not for today.
Thank you, Bill. No, it's never too late to be thinking, never too early, rather, to be thinking about tomorrow and the longer term. So thank you for putting that angle into our discussion today. Thank you to Mark and to David as well, and to all of our audience. It's been a great discussion. We will be up on our website if you want to go back on any points. Thank you for your attention. We'll just launch a final poll from our meetings team to help us find what other themes you'd like us to cover in the coming weeks. So we are hoping to have more content from you coming up, and Mark has spoken about some of the podcasts and commentaries that we have on the website, but it would be really helpful if you could let us know your preferences and we could tailor the content accordingly. Thank you very much for your attention today.